I'm Samantha Foster, and this is Venus Mastermind, a space for honest reflection, pattern breaking, and sovereign thinking. I'm not here to perform or to teach in a formal way. This is a shared reflection, a place to think out loud, to name what's been living in me, and to speak honestly about what I'm seeing and integrating. There's no agenda here beyond truth and presence. If something here resonates, take what's yours and leave the rest. Today, we're beginning something I've been sitting with for a while, a series called The Eternal Ecosystem. This is part 1, and we're starting where it all begins, morals. I want to invite you into a conversation about something that profoundly shapes our lives, not a philosophical debate, and not as a lecture on what you should believe. Instead, let's look honestly at how morals actually live in us, how they influence our self-judgment, our perceptions of others, and the stories we carry about what's good or bad, right or wrong, worthy or unworthy. Most of us navigate within moral systems we didn't consciously choose. Morals are often the first framework we inherit, long before we understand our values or even ourselves. We absorb notions of right and wrong. These ideas shape our understanding of what is acceptable, what makes someone respectable, and what brings approval and what brings shame. These moral concepts come from everywhere: our families, religions, cultures, communities, and survival environments. They're usually absorbed quietly, not taught as explicit concepts, but conveyed through tone, consequences, rewards, and punishments. They come through in who receives love and who gets corrected. When people struggle internally, feeling torn, conflicted, or constantly self-critical, it's rarely due to immorality. More often, it's because they're living inside a moral framework they've never examined. What I've come to understand is that morals are distinct from ethics, values, laws, and universal principles, though they're easy to conflate. Morals are meaning systems. They tell us what something signifies about ourselves, others, and the world. They define who is good and who is bad, who deserves care and who deserves consequences. What I want you to sit with is this: morals are judgment-based. And that's not a criticism. It's just how they function. Judgment is how morals work. They take complex situations and turn them into narratives we can live by. That's why morals are powerful. They provide structure, identity, and a sense of belonging. But this power comes with a cost. When morals are inherited without examination, they solidify into absolutes. They stop being guides and become weapons against ourselves, others, and against reality itself. This isn't about discarding discernment. It's about saying everything is fine or nothing matters. It's about softening those absolutes enough that real discernment can come through. Discernment isn't the same as moral judgment. Discernment is clarity without condemnation. As you sit with this, here's what I want you to know. You don't have to reject your morals, but you need to understand their origins. Which morals were inherited? Which were adopted for the sake of belonging? Which still align with your current self? And which are still shaping your life without your awareness? What I want to do in this episode is bring these stories into awareness, not to dismantle them, but to understand them. Because until we recognize the moral framework we operate from, we will continue to dress our lives at the level of behavior, boundaries, or communication when the real tension lies much deeper. So let's start there. Why morals feels so charged and why they almost never stay calm.
Why morals are so charged.
Morals are rarely examined calmly. When people argue about morals, it almost never stays intellectual. It escalates quickly. Voices tighten, defensiveness comes online, people feel attacked, misunderstood, or judged, even when no one is trying to be aggressive. And that's not accidental. Morals are charged because they're tied to identity. They're tied to belonging. They're tied to who we learned we had to be in order to be loved, accepted, or safe. Most of us don't experience morals as ideas. We experience them as who we are. That's why moral disagreement feels personal. It doesn't feel like someone disagrees with a belief. It feels like someone is questioning your character. You can see this clearly in places like religion or politics. When someone challenges a religious belief, it rarely lands as a theological disagreement. It lands as an attack on someone's goodness, their faith, their family, or their sense of meaning. When someone challenges a political position, it often isn't heard as a difference in policy. It's heard as an accusation. You're ignorant, you're dangerous, you're immoral. And once a belief is fused with a moral identity, the nervous system responds as if something vital is under threat. That's why conversations escalate so fast. That's why people stop listening. That's why things can turn aggressive, even violent. It's not because people are irrational. It's because what gets activated in us isn't designed for calm analysis. It's designed for protection. Morals are where shame lives. They're where righteousness lives. They're where belonging gets negotiated. They tell us who is good, who is bad, who deserves care, who deserves consequence. And most of the time, those judgments were formed long before we had language for them. So if this topic feels charged, if you notice resistance, discomfort, or a reflex to defend, that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're touching a system that was never designed to be neutral. This conversation isn't about tearing morals down. It's about inquiry, bringing awareness to something powerful that most of us are already living inside of without realizing it. Because morals shape how we judge ourselves. They shape how we judge others. They shape our sense of worth. And when something has that much influence over your life, it deserves to be examined gently, honestly, and without turning it into another test of being right. Morals are powerful. They're also often inherited, unquestioned, and quietly enforced. So now let's look at what morals actually are and where they come from.
Definition of morals and their origins.
So morals at their core. Morals are our internal systems of judgment about what's right and what's wrong, acceptable and not. It categories behaviors and people into groups like good or bad, right or wrong, worthy or unworthy. At their essence, morals are systems that create meaning. They don't just describe behavior, they interpret it. Morals help us answer questions like, is this right? Is this wrong? What does this say about me? And most importantly, what kind of person does this make me? That last question is more significant than most people realize. Morals don't primarily govern responsibility. They govern identity and judgment. They shape how we see ourselves. They shape who we believe we are allowed to be. They shape who we think deserves approval, punishment, forgiveness, or exclusion. And most of the time, they do this automatically. You don't usually experience your morals as thoughts. You feel them as reactions, as certainty, as discomfort, as the sense that something is just wrong or obviously right. That's because morals operate at the level of meaning, not analysis. They aren't asking, what's my responsibility here? They're asking, what does this say about me, who I am, or who you are? And that distinction is crucial. Morals don't regulate power. They don't regulate impact. They don't regulate responsibility. They regulate judgment. That doesn't make morals bad. It makes them powerful. And anything that powerful needs to be understood, especially if it's shaping your choices, your relationships, and the way you talk to yourself without your awareness. Most of us don't choose our morals. We inherit them. Very few people consciously decide what they believe is right or wrong. Instead, our morals are absorbed early, repeatedly, and often under emotional pressure. They come from our family systems: what was praised, what was punished, what was ignored, what was labeled good, selfish, dramatic, or unacceptable. They come from our religions, from doctrines about purity, obedience, sin, virtue, sacrifice, and forgiveness, from ideas about who is worthy, who needs redemption, and who is beyond it. They come from our culture and nationality, from what our society rewards, shames, normalizes, or denies, from beliefs about gender, success, and what it means to belong. They come from our community norms, from what keeps us inside the group, from what risks exclusion, and what makes us feel what makes us one of us. They also come from trauma and survival conditioning. When safety is threatened, our nervous system builds moral shortcuts. This is dangerous. This is unacceptable. This kind of person can't be trusted. These judgments aren't philosophical. They're protective. Our morals are also shaped by institutions, schools, corporations, governments, systems that reward compliance, punish dissent, and define what good behavior looks like in a very specific ways. And finally, our morals were reinforced through social groups and peer belonging. What gets approval, what gets mocked, what gets silenced, what gets celebrated. All of this happens long before most of us have language for it. So when someone feels intense certainty about what's right or wrong, that certainty didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built, reinforced, repeated, often at moments when belonging, safety, or love were on the line. And here's what this comes down to. Most of us are living inside of moral frameworks we never consciously examined. We're enforcing rules we didn't choose, judging ourselves by standards we didn't create, and reacting from beliefs that once made sense, but may no longer fit the life we're actually living. That doesn't mean those morals are wrong, but it does mean they're inherited. That's where awareness begins. Now that we know where morals come from, let's look at what they actually do and what they're not.
What morals actually do and what they are not.
Morals don't just exist as ideas. They do real work in our lives. They are the forces that organize our societies. At their heart, morals exist to bring us together. They give us a shared understanding of what needs to be protected, upheld, or avoided for our communities to thrive. The way we protect these values varies depending on what each society holds dear. In some cultures, harmony is the highest value. Public disruption, confrontation, or emotional exposure might be seen as morally wrong, not because they cause harm, but because they threaten the peace. In some places, duty and hierarchy are deeply respected. Fulfilling one's role, respecting elders, and prioritizing family or social obligations over personal desires are seen as moral virtues. In other societies, equality and moderation are key. Standing out too much, showing dominance, or taking more than one's share is viewed as morally inappropriate, even if no one is directly harmed. Each of these moral systems feel natural from within. They seem like just the way things should be. They're reinforced through approval, shame, and the threat of exclusion. Morals establish group norms. They teach us how to behave if we want to remain part of the community. They show us what earns respect, what risks rejection, and what brings safety. Morals also define who belongs and who doesn't, drawing invisible lines between acceptable and unacceptable people, insiders and outsiders, those worthy of care and those deserving of consequences. Belonging isn't negotiated through logic. It's negotiated through moral alignment. Morals help reduce uncertainty through judgment. Life is complex. Situations are ambiguous, and people are unpredictable. Morals simplify this complexity by sorting behavior into clear categories: right or wrong, good or bad, admirable or shameful. This simplification creates psychological stability, even when the judgment itself is inaccurate or outdated. Morals give us meaning and identity. They answer questions like, who am I allowed to be? What kind of person am I? And who are my people? Through morals, individuals and cultures signal who they are, what they stand for, and what they reject. And this signaling shapes our behavior. Morals work through approval and disapproval. They reward alignment and punish deviation, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, sometimes invisibly. That's why moral conflicts escalate so quickly. When morals clash, people aren't just debating ideas. They're defending their identity, their sense of belonging, and what their system has taught them must be protected. What I've come to see is this: morals aren't neutral systems. They are human, culturally shaped judgment frameworks designed to protect what a group feels is most important for survival and cohesion. That doesn't make them wrong, but it does mean they aren't universal, objective, or automatically aligned with responsibility or harm. And when morals are enforced without examination, especially across cultures, they stop being guides and start becoming weapons. Morals can feel so convincing from the inside that we often mistake them for things they are not. This confusion is where a lot of harm, rigidity, and unnecessary conflict begins. First, it's important to understand that morals are not the same as ethics. Morals judge, while ethics assess responsibility under power and impact. These are different functions, and confusing them can cloud our judgment. Second, morals are not universal truths. They may feel absolute within a culture or belief system, but that doesn't make them universally binding. A moral can feel unquestionable and still be culturally specific, historically contingent, or situationally limited. And they're not enforced by the universe. There's no cosmic mechanism ensuring that good people are rewarded or bad people are punished. When we expect reality to enforce more fairness, that's where disappointment follows. Holding the right moral position does not automatically mean someone is kind, responsible, or safe. Moral certainty can coexist with cruelty, avoidance, or harm, especially when morality is used to justify behavior instead of examine it. Morals are not evidence of spiritual maturity. Spiritual language layered on top of moral judgment does not transform it into wisdom. Righteousness can sound enlightened while still being rigid, fear-based, or disconnected from lived reality. Morals are not reliable indicators of safety or harm. Something can feel morally wrong and be harmless. Something can feel morally right and cause real damage. Moral intuition alone does not tell you who is affected, who holds power, or who bears the cost. And morals are not guarantee of outcomes. Doing what feels morally correct does not ensure protection, success, approval, or peace. Reality does not organize itself around moral deserving. Two things are worth sitting with here. Something can be morally condemned and ethically irrelevant. People may judge it harshly, but no responsibility, power imbalance, or real impact is involved. And something can be morally accepted and ethically harmful. A behavior can be normalized, praised, or tradition-bound and still cause preventable harm to someone with less power. Recognizing what morals are not doesn't weaken our discernment. It strengthens it, because once we stop asking morals to carry what they were never designed to hold, we can stop asking them to do the work of ethics, values, or truth, and that's where clarity begins. And that leads us to the distinction that matters most, the difference between morals and ethics. They're not the same thing, and mixing them up is where most people lose thread.
Morals versus ethics in universal law.
Morals and ethics are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same. They serve different purposes, and when we confuse them, both lose their effectiveness. Morals are judgment systems. They focus on right and wrong, assigning virtue or blame. They tell stories about character, who is good, who is bad, who is acceptable and who is not. Within a group, morals are often seen as absolute. Once established, they tend to be treated as non-negotiable. Violations are not just disagreements, they are seen as failure of character, loyalty, or integrity. Morals answer questions like, is this wrong? Is this acceptable? What kind of person does this make them? And what does it make me? Ethics, on the other hand, operate on a different level. Ethics are responsibility systems. They assess responsibility under power and regulate impact. They ask what is required when someone's actions affect others, especially when there is an imbalance of power, vulnerability, or influence. Ethics are contextual and situational. They are not fixed codes applied universally without regard for circumstances. Ethics can change depending on who holds power, who bears risk, who benefits, and who is impacted. Ethics ask different questions. What is my responsibility here? Who is affected by my choice? What power do I hold in this situation? And what harm is preventable? Am I preventing it? Here's the distinction. Morals ask, is this wrong? Ethics ask, what is my responsibility here? A situation can be morally charged and ethically simple. It can be morally neutral and ethically complex. And it can be morally approved while ethically harmful. Understanding this separation matters because morals evaluate identity while ethics regulate action. Morals judge while ethics hold responsibility. When we expect morals to do the work of ethics, judgment replaces accountability and clarity disappears. And once you feel the difference, a lot of things start to make sense. One of the most common confusions people carry is the belief that morals are enforced by the universe itself. They are not. Universal law has no judgment. The universe does not evaluate behavior through ideas like virtue, sin, goodness, badness, punishment, or reward. Those are human constructs. Universal law does not ask whether something is right or wrong. It does not care if someone was good or bad. It does not respond to intention, belief, or moral justification. Instead, universal law responds to patterns, reinforcement, and cause and effect. What is repeated strengthens, what is reinforced persists, what is neglected dissolves, what is enacted creates consequences, not judgment, but momentum. Morals, by contrast, are human meaning systems. They are how we interpret behavior, assign significance, and explain experience. They tell stories about deservingness, fairness, and identity. They are psychological and social frameworks, not cosmic ones. When we expect the universe to enforce morals, several things happen. Confusion replaces clarity, disappointment replaces discernment, and spiritual bypassing replaces responsibility. People begin to ask, why didn't the universe punish them? Why did something bad happen to a good person? And if I did everything right, why didn't I get the outcome I deserved? These questions assume a moral universe, but the universe is not moral. It is responsive. Expecting universal law to behave like a moral authority creates false hope and misplaced blame. It leads us to outsourcing responsibility upward instead of looking at patterns, power, choices, and reinforcement in real life. This doesn't mean morals are useless. It means that they have their place in human meaning-making identity and social systems. Universal law governs what happens when something is done. Morals govern what meaning we assign to what was done. Confusing the two doesn't make life more just. It makes reality harder to understand. And clarity begins when we stop asking the universe to judge and start asking ourselves to see. Now let's take this one layer wider, because morals don't just live inside us, they live inside cultures.
Morals and culture.
Morals don't form in a vacuum. They are shaped collectively, reinforced socially, and protected culturally. Different cultures moralize different behaviors. What feels obviously right in one society can feel deeply wrong in another. not because one group is more enlightened, but because moral systems are built to serve particular social needs. Every society defines what is normal, what is deviant, and what is virtuous. These definitions don't emerge randomly. They reflect what a culture needs to survive, stabilize, and reproduce itself. In some cultures, obedience is moralized. In others, independence is. In some cultures, restraint is praised. In others, expression is. In other cultures, hierarchy is treated as natural and moral. In others, equality is. These aren't just preferences. They are moral frameworks, systems that reward certain behaviors with approval and punish others with shame, exclusion, or force. Cultural morals often protect hierarchy, power structures, and survival strategies. What a society moralizes usually aligns with who benefits from the existing order. That doesn't mean cultures are malicious. It means morals are functional. They help groups cohere, reduce uncertainty, and tell people how to belong. But that function comes with a limit. Cultural morality explains behavior. It does not guarantee justice. A society can morally justify exploitation, silencing, violence, and inequality, and sincerely believe it is right. History makes this clear. Practices that are now widely condemned were once morally defended, sometimes passionately, not because people lacked morals, but because their morals served the system they lived inside. That's why moral certainty is not the same as moral clarity. A culture can agree on something and still be wrong. A behavior can be normalized and still be harmful. A moral code can create order and still cause injury. And when culture morals go unexamined, individuals absorb them as personal truth. They don't just think, this is how things are done. They think, this is who I am supposed to be. That's how cultural morals move from society into identity. That's how social rules become internal laws. And that's how people end up defending moral systems that harm them or others without realizing why. This isn't about rejecting culture. It's about recognizing that morality is shaped by context, power, and history, not by universal truth. And once you see that, something shifts. You stop assuming that what feels morally obvious is automatically just. You stop treating disagreement as moral failure, and you gain the ability to ask a more precise question. What does this moral protect? And who does it cost? That question doesn't destroy meaning, it refines it. And here's where it gets personal. Because cultural morals don't stay cultural. They move inside us, and they fuse with identity. That's where we're going next.
How morals become entangled with identity and common moral confusions.
Morals rarely stay at the level of belief. Over time, they become intertwined with our identity. For many of us, morals become directly tied to our self-worth, safety, and sense of belonging. They stop being just ideas about right and wrong and start becoming conditions for being loved, accepted, or included. This is how moral systems gain their emotional force. When a moral is violated, the experience is rarely neutral. It doesn't feel like a simple disagreement with a belief. Instead, it feels like I am a bad person. I failed in some fundamental way. I could lose love, approval, or belonging. Or I might be rejected or exiled. That reaction isn't irrational. It's learned. Many moral frameworks were formed in environments where belonging was conditional. Approval followed compliance. Love followed alignment. Safety followed obedience. Over time, our nervous system learned to equate moral alignment with survival. So when a moral is questioned by someone else or by life itself, it doesn't register as an intellectual inquiry. It registers as a threat. That's why moral challenges feel so intense. They activate fear, defensiveness, and collapse, not because someone is wrong, but because our identity feels at risk. That's also where moral injury occurs. Moral injury happens when lived experience contradicts inherited morals in a way that can't be reconciled. In my own life growing up, morals weren't presented as guidance or meaning. They were enforced as absolute authority. My stepfather used religion as a moral weapon. Biblical verses weren't teachings, they were justifications. Spare the rod, spoil the child became permission to beat us for no reason. Turn the other cheek became permission to hit us again. Man is made in the image of God became justification for domination, that wives and children must bow, serve, and submit. Scriptures about cutting out a lying tongue became a tool for terror and shame whenever he decided we were dishonest. In that environment, morality wasn't about goodness. It was about control, fear, and compliance. Violating a moral didn't mean you made a mistake. It meant you deserved pain. It meant you were bad. It meant love could be withdrawn at any moment. That's how morals fuse with identity at the deepest level, and this pattern isn't unique. Moral injury also occurs when what you were taught doesn't match what you live. When good people were supposed to be rewarded, but you witnessed harm go unpunished. When obedience was supposed to be virtuous, but it cost you your well-being. When sacrifice was moral, but it led to resentment or burnout. Or when speaking up felt wrong or right, and reality punished you either way. When this happens, something fractures internally. If the moral framework cannot adapt, the person pays the price. They may turn judgment inward. They may suppress truth. They may split parts of themselves into acceptable and unacceptable. They may double down on the moral to preserve belonging or abandon themselves to survive. Moral injury is not a failure of character. It's a failure of inherited systems to account for reality. And until morals are disentangled from identity, people remain trapped in a cycle where questioning a belief feels like losing themselves. That's why examining morals is not an academic exercise. It's an act of self-recovery, not to discard meaning, but to separate who you are from the judgments you inherited. That separation is what makes the next layers, values, ethics, standards, and boundaries possible without collapse. Once morals become intertwined with our identity, they rarely stay in their own lane. They start bleeding into other systems, creating confusion, not because we lack intelligence or awareness, but because we use multiple internal systems interchangeably without distinction. One of the most common confusions is between morals and ethics. When we use morals to make ethical claims, responsibility gets replaced with judgment. Instead of asking who has power here or who is affected, the conversation collapses into who is right and who is wrong. You can see this clearly in debates around immigration. On one side, people say, this is wrong, it's unethical, laws exist for a reason. On the other side, people say, this is wrong, it's unethical, human suffering matters more than borders. Both sides feel morally certain and experience their position as obvious, and both sides often skip the ethical questions entirely. Ethics would ask who has power, who is vulnerable, who benefits, who bears the cost, what harm is preventable, and by whom. But moral judgment bypasses those questions. It turns the issue into a referendum on goodness. If you believe this, you're immoral. At that point, responsibility disappears and identity defense takes over. Another place the same confusion shows up is around free speech. One side moralizes free speech as courage, truth, and freedom. Silencing people is wrong. The other side moralizes restriction as care and protection. Allowing harmful speech is wrong. Again, the debate isn't actually about responsibility, power, or impact. It's about who is good and who is bad. Instead of asking who controls the platform, who has influence, who is vulnerable, what responsibility comes with amplification, the argument becomes, if you support this, you're immoral. If you oppose this, you're immoral. In both cases, morals are doing the work ethics was meant to do, and failing. Another common confusion is between morals and values. People say, I believe this, so everyone should. But belief does not equal value, and value does not equal obligation. Morals tend to universalize. This is how people should live. Values are personal and prioritized. This is what I choose, even when trade-offs exist. When morals masquerade as values, we start policing others instead of examining ourselves. The question shifts from, what do I actually live by, to, why aren't you living by this too? Preferences are another place morals hide. I don't like this, so it's bad. Discomfort becomes condemnation. Tastes become virtue. Aversions become judgment. But preference is not morality. Not liking something does not make it wrong, because unfamiliar does not make it immoral, and irritation does not equal ethical harm. Fear is another powerful source of moral confusion. This feels unsafe, so it must be wrong. The nervous system reacts faster than reflection. When something triggers fear, uncertainty, or loss of control, the mind often reaches for morality to explain the reaction. The moral story follows the body's reaction. That doesn't make the fear invalid, but it does mean the moral conclusion may not be accurate. Fear is about protection. Morals are about meaning. Confusing the two turns survival responses into judgments about character or worth. Finally, trauma responses are frequently moralized. This reminds me of harm, so it's immoral. When someone has been hurt, their nervous system becomes highly attuned to cues that resemble past danger. That sensitivity is adaptive, but when trauma responses are treated as moral truth, the world becomes divided into good and bad based on personal injury rather than present reality. Pain becomes proof. Reaction becomes righteousness. This is how unresolved trauma can quietly turn into moral absolutism without anyone intending harm. All of these confusions have one thing in common. They move moral judgment into places it was never designed to operate. Instead of helping us understand meaning, morals get used to explain fear, justify discomfort, enforce preference, or avoid responsibility. And when that happens, clarity is lost. This isn't about invalidating anyone's feelings, experiences, or beliefs. It's about precision. Because when morals are doing the job of ethics, values, preferences, or trauma processing, they become blunt instruments. They flatten complexity. They shut down inquiry, and they make it nearly impossible to tell what's actually happening in a situation. That's why disentangling morals matter. Not so we stop caring about right and wrong, but so we stop using moral judgment to solve problems it cannot solve. That's the work of the next layers. So what happens to the nervous system when morals are being used this way, outward as a weapon or inward as punishment? Let's look at that.
Nervous system impact when morals are used externally and internally.
When we use morals to judge, correct, or control others, our nervous system reacts immediately. Shame becomes the driving force. Instead of curiosity, we find correction. Instead of responsibility, we see righteousness. Instead of building relationships, we focus on positioning. Moral judgment tells our nervous system, you are wrong as a person, rather than something happened that needs repair, or there's harm here we should understand. Shame works quickly because it threatens our sense of belonging. It signals conform or be excluded. That's why environments filled with moral judgment feel tense, even when no one is yelling. Our bodies sense it. Say the wrong thing, think the wrong thought, step out of line, and something bad happens. This can look very ordinary. It might be a workplace where someone asks a genuine question and is met with, "We don't think like that here." It could be a family dinner where a different opinion gets labeled selfish, ignorant, or disrespectful. It might be a social group where silence earns safety and curiosity earns a side eye. It could be an online space where one misstep turns into public correction instead of conversation. Nothing dramatic has to happen for our nervous system to register the threat. Belonging is being negotiated in real time. When we use morals this way, power hides behind righteousness. Control doesn't look like control anymore. It looks like being right. It looks like being on the right side. It looks like moral certainty. That's how people justify behavior they would otherwise recognize as harmful. Shaming becomes accountability. Silencing becomes protection. Coercion becomes care. Punishment becomes for your own good. And once righteousness enters the system, dialogue collapses. People stop listening. They stop asking questions. They stop considering context, impact, or complexity. Because dialogue requires safety, and moral judgment removes it. When someone feels morally judged, their nervous system goes into defense, fight, freeze, fawn, or shut down. At that point, no one is actually hearing each other. They're defending identity, they're protecting belonging, and they're trying not to be labeled bad. That's where polarization accelerates. The world splits into good people versus bad people, right side versus wrong side, us versus them. Nuance disappears, repair becomes impossible, and complexity feels dangerous. In these environments, people stop living their truth. They start performing goodness. They say the right things, they hide doubts, they suppress questions. They learn which moral language earns safety. Outward compliance increases, inner integrity erodes. And that's how harm gets justified, for the greater good. Once moral judgment is in charge, almost anything can be defended. Humiliation, exclusion, violence, silencing, abuse of authority, all in the name of righteousness, all framed as necessary, all insulated from accountability. Because when we use morals externally to regulate others, our nervous system learns a dangerous lesson. Power belongs to whoever claims moral authority, and that lesson doesn't create safety. It creates fear. It creates submission, or it creates revolt. But it does not create truth, and it does not create responsibility. That's the cost of using morals where ethics should be. When we turn morals inward and use moral judgment against ourselves, our nervous system reacts in a quieter but equally destabilizing way. Instead of shame coming from the outside, it becomes self-generated. We become both the judge and the accused. This shows up as chronic self-judgment, with an internal voice that is always evaluating. Was that okay? Did I do that wrong? What does this say about me? There's guilt, but not the kind that leads to repair. This is guilt without resolution, guilt without a clear action, guilt that lingers because it's tied to identity, not behavior. At the core of this pattern is a persistent fear of being bad, not mistaken, not misinformed, not human, bad. And when we believe that being bad risks love, safety, or belonging, our nervous system adapts accordingly. Truth gets suppressed, not because we're dishonest, but because honesty feels dangerous. If saying what's real might reveal something wrong about us, silence becomes protection. Over time, parts of ourselves begin to split. There's the acceptable self, the part that follows the rules, performs goodness, and earns approval. And then there's the unacceptable self, the parts that feel angry, uncertain, desiring, questioning, or out of alignment. Those parts don't disappear. They get pushed underground. This internal splitting costs energy. It creates constant self-monitoring, second-guessing, over-explaining, and hesitation before choice. Agency begins to collapse. Instead of asking, what do I actually want or need here, the question becomes, what is the correct thing to do? Or worse, what will make me less wrong? Decision-making becomes heavy. Choices feel dangerous. Movement requires justification, and none of this requires extreme circumstances to develop. This happens in everyday environments. Homes where love was conditional, schools where approval was earned, workplaces where being good meant being compliant, and communities where belonging depended on alignment. The nervous system learns a simple equation. Moral correctness equals safety. Deviation equals risk. So we adapt, not by becoming more truthful, but by becoming more careful, more palatable, more restrained, more disconnected from ourselves. The loss here isn't just emotional, it's existential. Authenticity erodes. Desire becomes suspect. Instincts gets overridden. And the most painful part is this. From the outside, we may look ethical, kind, responsible, even admirable. But internally, we feel frozen, muted, unsure of who we are without the moral framework telling us what's acceptable. This is not integrity. It's survival disguised as goodness. And until morals are separated from identity, our nervous system will continue to treat self-expression as a threat. That's why moral examination isn't self-indulgent, it's stabilizing. Because agency cannot exist where every choice is a test of worth. And until morals stop functioning as internal punishment systems, values, ethics, standards, and boundaries can't fully take root. They require a self that is allowed to exist without being constantly judged for it. So what shifts when we stop letting morals run on autopilot? What does it feel like to hold them consciously with awareness? That's what we're looking at now.
What morals feel like when held consciously?
When we examine and consciously hold our morals, something subtle but profound changes. Rigidity softens. It's not that things stop mattering, but meaning is no longer tied to survival. We can hold our beliefs without gripping them tightly. Our convictions can exist without the need to dominate or defend. This brings more discernment. Instead of automatic judgment, there's space to ask, what's actually happening here? What matters in this context? What's mine to decide and what isn't? Discernment doesn't rush to categorize people as good or bad. It stays present long enough to notice nuance, impact, and complexity. Shame reduces, not because responsibility disappears, but because our identity is no longer on trial. Mistakes stop feeling like evidence of being fundamentally wrong. They become information, feedback, something that can be responded to rather than punished. This creates a higher tolerance for complexity. We can hold contradictions without panic. Growth doesn't require erasing the past. Change doesn't feel like betrayal. We can revise our beliefs without an identity collapse. Letting go of a moral doesn't feel like losing ourselves or our values. It feels like updating a map that no longer matches the terrain. There's room to say, this one made sense. This protected me. This no longer fits the life I'm living. And that process doesn't require shame, exile, or justification. Moral clarity remains, but moral superiority fades. We can know what we stand for without needing to stand above others. We can hold convictions without using them to regulate or rank people. There's less urgency to convince, less need to correct, and less fear of being challenged. Because when we hold our morals consciously, they no longer carry the burden of identity. They inform our perspective without defining our worth. They guide our meaning without enforcing compliance. They coexist with humility, and most importantly, agency returns. Choices stop feeling like moral tests. Decisions stop requiring self-erasure. Movement becomes possible without constant internal negotiation. This is not moral relativism. It's moral maturity. It's the difference between being ruled by inherited judgment and being able to choose, revise, and respond with awareness. And that's what makes the next layers possible. Because once our morals are no longer fused with our identity, values can be clarified without guilt, ethics can be practiced without fear, standards can be set without righteousness, boundaries can exist without punishment. This is the foundation, and it's what allows judgment to loosen without losing discernment. Which brings us to a question that comes up often. When people want a clean answer to, are morals good or bad?
Are morals good or bad? Clean answer.
Morals are neither universally good or universally bad. They are tools. Like any tool, their impact depends on how they're used, what they're used for, and whether the person using them understands their function. Morals can be incredibly useful. They create cohesion, offer shared meaning, and help people orient themselves in a complex world. They provide identity, both individual and collective, and answer the question, what kind of people are we? They help groups function, keep individuals anchored, and reduce uncertainty. But morals become dangerous when they are unquestioned, made absolute, weaponized, or confused with systems they were never meant to replace. When morals go unquestioned, they stop being guides and start becoming laws, enforced without reflection. When they're made absolute, complexity disappears, context no longer matters, impacts become irrelevant, only correctness remains. When morals are weaponized, they become tools of control. They justify harm, silent dissent, and protect power while claiming virtue. And when morals are confused with ethics, something especially damaging happens. Responsibility gets replaced with judgment. Power hides behind righteousness. People argue about who is right instead of asking who is affected. And at that point, morals are no longer helping anyone live well. They're being used to avoid accountability. So the question isn't whether morals are good or bad. The question is whether they are conscious or unconscious, examined or inherited, flexible or rigid, in service of meaning or in service of control. Morals are at their best when they help people make sense of life without pretending to be universal truth. They are at their worst when they are treated as cosmic law, moral superiority, or proof of worth. This isn't an argument against morals. It's an argument of discernment. Because when morals are understood as tools, not truths, you can use them without being ruled by them. And that distinction is what allows the next layers, values, ethics, standards, and boundaries to function without collapsing into shame, control, or confusion. That's the clarity this episode is building toward. And I want to close this episode with something lived, not just theoretical, because that's what the whole arc has been pointing toward.
A lived example, how a moral becomes a value, a standard, and a boundary.
One moral I hold dearly revolves around responsibility versus avoidance. I often find myself judging people who don't take responsibility for their choices, systems or individuals who externalize blame, and emotional or functional helplessness that isn't paired with effort. The underlying moral here is simple. Once someone becomes aware, they are responsible for themselves. This moral took root early in my life. Responsibility arrived early, and avoidance had real costs. When others didn't take ownership, the consequences often fell on me. So this moral wasn't random, it was protective. It organized reality in a way that made survival possible. But here's where the distinction matters. When this moral goes unexamined, it manifests as frustration, impatience, tightness in the body, and that internal thought, why don't they just? At that point, it's no longer discernment, it's charge. When I examine the moral instead of reacting from it, the structure underneath becomes visible. What I'm actually valuing is sovereignty, ownership, agency, the ability to say, this is mine. Once that value is clear, a standard naturally emerges. It's not a judgment about who someone is, but a clarity about who I engage with. The standard sounds like this. I engage with people who can own their choices and their consequences. Say moral, but no condemnation, no superiority, just information. And then without force, a boundary appears. I can have compassion for someone's circumstances without absorbing responsibility for their decisions. I can recognize struggle without stepping into rescuing, over-explaining, or carrying weight that isn't mine. What used to feel like irritation becomes a signal. What used to feel like judgment becomes clarity. And the line becomes clean. Self-accountability is non-negotiable for me. Taking accountability for others is not. Blame shifting isn't a flaw I need to correct. It's a red flag that tells me where disengagement is appropriate. At an identity level, my system knows this. If I accept responsibility that isn't mine, I lose sovereignty. That judgment was never about being better than anyone. It was about protecting agency. Once I see that, the charge dissolves. The moral doesn't disappear, it becomes owned. And what's left isn't hardness, it's leadership. I didn't soften the moral, I clarified its jurisdiction. And that's the arc this series is pointing toward. That's why examining morals matters. When morals stay unconscious, they leak as judgment. When they are brought into awareness, they organize values. Values shape standards. Standards make boundaries clean. Nothing gets harsher. Everything gets clearer. And that's where we're going in the next episode as we cover values. I'm going to pause here and let this land. If something in this resonated, you don't need to do anything with it. Just sit with it and notice what continues to unfold. Thank you for listening and for being here with me.